Celebrity Storytime. How are you doing today? We are going to be reading a story, but first up we are going to be doing the joke of the day with Daniel. Then we are going to be reading the Bible, the Bible.
Wait, we're doing. Oh yeah, joke of the day's first. I forgot.
Then we are going to be doing the Synopsis with Kim. Then we are going to be doing Hinds. You know where I place this? Sorry, I have so many books. Yeah. And make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell, and never miss another video. And I bid you adieu. I'm not leaving, but
You're not leaving.
I'm leaving, but my dad's coming.
No, I'm doing
Daniel's
the joke of the
coming.
day.
Well, Daniel's coming, not me. I'm a French fry.
Okay, so this is my first time doing it in a while. Once again, just haven't been really up to it the last couple days. So, Jessica says, "Hey guys, sorry I missed yesterday. I'm excited to conclude the story today." Anyway, what I was saying, why couldn't a pirate play cards? Play a game of cards?
I don't know. Why could a pirate not play a game of cards?
Because he was sitting on the deck.
Oh! Goodness. Stop. That actually took me a second to get it. But it was funny. Okay, so we started Jonah yesterday. Now we're going to finish Jonah. So that is Jonah. That's sort of like Jonah and sort of like Yoda. So it's like a combination of the two. Haha. Oh, Jessica gave you some happy faces. I hope that was to Daniel's joke and not to me mispronouncing Jonah. So, all right. So now we're going to begin chapter 3 of Jonah. We did read not verses 1 and 2. We read chapters 1 and 2 yesterday. And now we're going to read chapters 3 and 4. And if you can't leave the dark saber off, then I will take it up. All right, perfect. So now, this is the English Standard Version of the Old Testament. And here we go. I should wait for Daniel to come back. He had to go run an errand real fast. He'll be right back. Daniel's joke, haha, bad timing. What? Okay. All right, so Jonah, chapter 3. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it the message that I tell you," which is very ironically similar to what he said in chapter 1. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, 3 days' journey in breadth. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's journey, and he called out, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." And the people of Nineveh believed God. They called for a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest of them to the least of them. The word reached the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. And he issued a proclamation and published through Nineveh, "By the decree of the king and his nobles, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Let them not feed nor drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth. And let them call out mightily to God. Let everyone turn from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hands. Who knows? God may turn and relent and turn from his fierce anger so that we may not perish." When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it. Chapter 4. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. And he prayed to the Lord and said, "O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish. For I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. And the Lord said, Do you do well to be angry? Jonah went out of the city and sat to the east of the city and made a booth for himself there. He sat under it in the shade till he should see what would become of the city. Now the Lord God appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be a shade over his head to save him from his discomfort. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant. But when dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant, so that it withered. When the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah, so that he was faint. And he asked that he might die, and said, It is better for me to die than to live. But God said to Jonah, Do you do well to be angry for the plant? And he said, Yes, I do well to be angry, angry enough to die. And the Lord said, You pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should not I pity Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle? And that is the end of Jonah. A very harsh lesson there. So, at this time,
Easton.
we have the marvelous Kimberly.
Dion. Kimberly.
Mom did my hair. Earlier in the day, I drew this.
The shading is remarkable.
The shading took several hours. So what happened in the last chapter was, much afraid, she woke up, and then she waited for a day, and she bathed in the springs, and the springs, they made her not lame anymore. She's no longer a cripple. And so what happened is, she goes up and she gets, she's called by the shepherd, so she goes over to him, and, Jessica says, cute hairstyle and very well done on the shading. Thank you. So she gets, her Hinds feet, and the shepherd gives her a new name, and the new name is Grace and Glory. You know what I think? I think that eventually she's gonna go down the mountain, and then her old enemies are gonna see her and not even know who on earth she is. And then she'll be like, but you knew me by a different name. I was much afraid. And Granny Bear says, wow, nice focus on the drawing. Cute hair, looks fun. Good job, Mom. Thank you, Mommy.
You're welcome.
And then, so she's got Hinds feet now, and the first word was grace and glory.
I didn't say and glory. I said grace.
I know, but the first word is grace, and then the next two words are and glory.
But you don't know that for sure.
But I do, because that's her name.
Could she have peeked?
No.
Maybe she let.
All
That's her
right,
name,
let's
though.
find out in just a minute.
Just 2 seconds.
All right, so just a little bit of housekeeping. So just a reminder, we are going to be starting a new book tomorrow, and we have a time schedule on that book. So if you're not able to make it every night, we will be sure to post those on YouTube so that you can watch them at your leisure whenever you want to. And I'm not divulging the name of that book at this time. We will also be reading another book, and this time, since Jonah was so short, we will pick another Old Testament book. and we will read that alongside the book that currently has no name. Well, it has a name, but you don't know it. So, with all that being said, we are now ready to begin reading the final 2 chapters of Hinds' Feet on High Places. If you noticed, I did title this video, I've been titling them Much Afraid, and this one is not Much Afraid, but it is Grace and Glory.
See?
Is the title of the video. Because that is the name of the main character.
Okay.
All right, so now here we go. Chapter 19, High Places. Grace and Glory, with her handmaidens, Joy and Peace. You forgot to mention that Sorrow and Suffering changed their names too. Joy and Peace stayed up on the high places for several weeks while all 3 explored the heights and learned many new lessons from the king. He led them himself to many places and explained to them as much as they were able to understand at that time. He also encouraged them to explore on their own, for there are always new and lovely discoveries to make up there on the high places. Even these high places were not the highest of all. Others towered above them into the sky, where mortal eye could no longer follow them, and where only those who have finished their pilgrim life on earth are able to go. Grace and Glory and her friends were on the lowest, the beginner's slope. I almost said the beginningest. The beginner's slope in the kingdom of love, and these were the parts which they were to explore and enjoy at this time. From these slopes, too, they were able to look down on the valleys below, and from that new viewpoint gain an understanding of many things which had been puzzling and mysterious to them before. From beneath they had not been seen clearly, and even then only a small part had been visible. The first thing, however, which they realized up there on the slopes of the kingdom of love was how much more there would be to see and learn and understand when the king took them higher on future occasions. The glorious view which they now enjoyed was but small in comparison with all that lay beyond and would be visible only from yet higher places above. It was now perfectly evident to them that there must be ranges upon ranges of which they had never even dreamt while they were still down in the narrow valleys with their extraordinary limited views. Sometimes, as she looked on the glorious panorama visible from these lowest slopes in the kingdom of love, she found herself blushing as she remembered some of the dogmatic statements which she and others had made in the depths of the valley about the high places and the ranges of truth. They had been able to see so little and were so unconscious of what lay beyond and above. If that had been the case while down in the valley, how much more clearly she now realized that even up on those wonderful slopes she was only looking out on a tiny corner of the whole. She never tired of looking from the glorious new viewpoint on the first slopes of the kingdom of love and seeing it all from a new perspective. What she could see and could take in almost intoxicated her with joy and thanksgiving, and sometimes even with inexpressible relief. Things which she had thought dark and terrible, and which had made her tremble as she looked up from the valley because they had seemed so alien to any part of the realm of love, were now seen to be but parts of a great and wonderful whole. They were so altered and modified that as she saw what they extended into, she wondered at having been so blind and stupid, at having had such false ideas about them. She began to understand quite clearly that truth cannot be understood from books alone or by any written words. but only by personal growth and development in understanding, and that things written even in the book of books can be astonishingly misunderstood while one still lives on the low levels of spiritual experience and on the wrong side of the grave on the mountains. She perceived that no one who finds herself up on the slopes of the kingdom of love can possibly dogmatize about what is seen there, because it is only then that she comprehends how small a part of the glorious whole she sees. All she can do is to grasp with wonder, awe, and thanksgiving, and to long with all her heart to go higher and to see and understand more. Paradoxical as it may seem, as she gazed out on dazzling vistas so glorious that she could not look at them steadily or grasp their magnificent sweep, she often thought that the prayer which best expressed her heart's desire was that of the blind man. Lord, that I might receive my sight, help me to open myself to more light, help me to fuller understanding. Another thing which gave her continual joy was their unbroken communion with the king. Wherever he went, she and peace and joy went too, springing behind him with a delight which at times was almost hilarious, for he was teaching and training them to use their hinds feet. Grace and Glory quickly saw, however, that he always chose the way most carefully and restrained his own amazing strength and power, taking only such springs and bounds as they could manage to. So graciously did he adapt himself to what was possible to their newly acquired capacity that they scarcely recognized in the exhilaration of leaping and skipping like hinds on the mountains, that had he really extended his powers, they would have been left behind completely. For Grace and Glory, who had been lame and limping all her life, the ecstasy of leaping about in this way and of bounding from rock to rock on the high places as easily as the mountain rose was so rapturous that she could hardly bear to cease from it even for rests. The king seemed to find great delight in encouraging this, and led her on, taking longer and longer leaps, until at last she would be quite breathless. Then, as they sat side by side on some new crag to which he had led her, while she rested, he would point out some of the vistas to be seen from the new viewpoint. On one of these occasions, after they had been up on the high places for several days, she flung herself down on the lichen and moss-covered crag to which he had led her, and laughing and breathless said, "Even hinds' feet seem to need a rest now and then." "Grace and Glory," he answered, "do you think you understand how I was able to make your feet like hinds' feet and to set you on these high places?" She drew closer to him and looked earnestly into his face and asked, "How were you able to do this, my lord and king?" "Think back over the journey you made," he replied, "and tell me what lessons you learned on the way." She was silent for a while as she reviewed the whole journey, which had seemed so terribly long, and in some places so cruelly difficult and even impossible. She thought of the altars which she had built along the way, of the time when she had stood with him at the trying place in the valley, when he had called her to follow him to the heights. She remembered the walk to the foot of the mountains, the first meeting with suffering and sorrow, and of learning to accept their help. She recalled the shock of what had seemed such a heartbreaking detour down into the desert, and of the things which she had seen there. Then their journey along the shores of loneliness, the empty cove which the sea had filled to the brim, and then the agony of disappointment and frustration experienced in the wilderness when the path once again had turned away from the high places. She remembered crossing the great sea wall, walking through the woods and valleys until the rapturous moment when the path had turned back toward the mountains. Her thoughts turned to the precipice of injury, the forest of danger. and tribulation, the great storm during which they had sheltered in the hut, and then the mist, the endless mist, and the awful moment when the path suddenly led down into the valley of loss, and the nightmare abyss of horror into which she had looked when she had thought of turning back. She recalled the descent down into the valley of loss and the peace she had found there before reascending to the heights in the aerial chairs, and of the days spent in that place where she had been prepared for her burial. Then that last agonizing ascent, and the cave where they sheltered from the floods, and where she had been tempted to cast away the promises. Then the spring called Marah, and finally the mist-shrouded grave up among the peaks where she had been bound to the altar. How little she had imagined when first she set out on that strange journey, what lay ahead of her, and the things which she would be called upon to pass through. So, for a long time she sat silent, remembering, wondering, and thankful. At last she put her hand in his hand and said softly, "My lord, I will tell you what I learned." "Tell me," he answered gently. "First," said she, "I learned that I must accept with joy all that you allowed to happen to me on the way and everything to which the path led me. That I was never to try to evade it, but to accept it and lay down my own will on the altar and say, 'Behold me, I am thy little handmaiden, acceptance with joy.'" He nodded without speaking, and she went on. "Then I learned that I must bear all that others were allowed to do against me, and to forgive with no trace of bitterness, and to say to thee, 'Behold me, I am thy little handmaiden, bearing with love,' that I may receive power to bring good out of this evil." Again he nodded, and she smiled still more sweetly and happily. "The third thing that I learned was that you, my lord, never regarded me as I actually was, lame and weak and crooked and cowardly. You saw me as I would be when you had done what you promised, and had brought me to the high places, when it could be truly said, 'There is none that walks with such a queenly ease, nor with such grace as she.' You always treated me with the same love and graciousness, as though I were a queen already, and not wretched little much afraid." Then she looked up into his face, and for a little time could say no more, but at last she added, "My lord, I cannot tell you how greatly I want to regard others in the same way." A very lovely smile broke out on his face at that, but he still said nothing, only nodded for the third time, and waited for her to continue. "The fourth thing," said she with a radiant face, "was really the first I learned up here. Every circumstance in life, no matter how crooked and distorted and ugly it appears to be, if it is reacted to in love and forgiveness and obedience to your will, can be transformed. Therefore, I begin to think, my lord, you purposefully allowed us to be brought into contact with the bad and evil things that you want changed. Perhaps that is the very reason why we are here in this world, where sin and sorrow and suffering and evil abound, so that we may let you teach us to react to them, that out of them we can create lovely qualities to live forever. That is the only really satisfactory way of dealing with evil, not simply binding it so that it cannot work harm, but whenever possible overcoming it with good." At last he spoke. "You have learned well, Grace and Glory. Now I will add one thing more. It was these lessons which you have learned which enabled me to change you from limping, crippled, much afraid, into Grace and Glory with the hinds' feet. Now you are able to run, leaping on the mountains, and able to follow me wherever I go, so that we need never be parted again. So remember this, as long as you are willing to be acceptance with joy and bearing in love, you can never again become crippled and you will be able to go wherever I lead you. You will be able to go down into the valley of the world to work with me there, for that is where the evil and sorrow and ugly things are which need to be overcome. Accept and bear and obey the law of love, and nothing will be able to cripple your hinds feet or to separate you from me. This is the secret of the high places, grace and glory. It is the lovely and perfect law of the whole universe. It is this that makes the radiant joy of the heavenly places. Then he rose to his feet, drew her up beside him, and said, Now use your hinds feet again, for I am going to lead you to another part of the mountain. Off he went, leaping on the mountains and skipping on the hills, with grace and glory following close behind, and the beautiful figures of peace and joy springing at her side. And as they went, she sang this song. Set me as a seal upon thine heart, thou love more strong than death, that I may feel through every part thy burning fiery breath. And then, like wax held in the flame, may take the imprint of thy name. Set me a seal upon thine arm, thou love that bursts the grave. Thy coals of fire can never harm, but only purge and save. Thou jealous love, thou burning flame, O burn out all unlike thy name. The floods can never drown thy love, nor weaken thy desire. The rains may deluge from above, but never quench thy fire. Make soft my heart in thy strong flame, to take the imprint of thy name. Canticles 8:6. Chapter 20. Return to the valley. The place to which the King of Love now brought them was a most beautiful valley among the peaks of the high places. The whole of this sheltered spot was laid out in quiet gardens and orchards and vineyards. Here grew flowers of rarest beauty, and lilies of every description. Here, too, were trees of spices, and of many kinds of fruits, and nut trees, almonds and walnuts, and many other varieties which Grace and Glory had never seen before. Here the king's gardeners were always busy, pruning the trees, tending the plants in the vines, and preparing beds for the new seedlings and tender shoots. These the king himself transplanted from uncongenial soil and conditions in the valleys below, so that they might grow to perfection and bloom in that valley high above, ready to be planted in other parts of the kingdom of love, to beautify and adorn it wherever the king saw fit. They spent several delightful days watching the gardeners as they worked under the gracious supervision of the king himself, and accompanying him as he walked in the vineyards, teaching and advising those who tended the vines. One day, however, Grace and Glory, with her 2 attendants, walked to the end of the valley and found themselves on the very edge of the high places, from which they could look right down into the low places far below. As they stood there, they saw a long green valley between 2 chains of mountains, through which a river wound like a ribbon of light. Here and there were patches of brown and red, which seemed to be villages and dwelling places surrounded with trees and gardens. All of a sudden, Grace and Glory gave a queer little gasp, for she recognized the place. They were looking down into the Valley of Humiliation itself, the place where she had lived in misery for so long, and from which the shepherd had called her to the high places. Without a word, she sat down on the grassy slope, and as she looked, a multitude of thoughts filled her mind. Down there was a little white cottage where she had lived, and the pastures where the shepherds tended the king's flocks. There were the sheepfolds and the stream where the flocks went to drink, and where she had met the shepherd for the first time. In that valley were all her fellow workers and the friends among whom she had lived, and with whom she had enjoyed such happy fellowship. Others she had known were there too. Away on the outskirts of the village was the cottage where her Aunt Dismal Forebodings lived, and where she had spent her miserable childhood with her cousins Gloomy and Spiteful and Craven Fear. As she thought of them and their wretched existence, a pang of compassion and pain shot through her heart. Poor Aunt Dismal, trying to hide the fact that her heart was broken by the unhappy marriages which her 2 daughters had made, and embittered by the shameful doings of her darling son, she saw the dwellings of her other relatives, the manor house where decrepit old Lord Fearing lived, tortured by his failing powers and his dread of approaching death. There was the house where Pride lived, and near it the house of bitterness and resentment, the homes. And under those dark trees lived miserable self-pity. She recognized the dwelling places of those who had harassed her on the journey to the high places, and round about were the homes of other inhabitants of the valley, people who hated and despised or rejected the shepherd. As Grace and Glory sat looking down into the valley, the tears welled into her eyes, and her heart throbbed with pain, 2 sensations which she had completely forgotten up there on the high places. Suddenly she discovered that her feelings toward her relatives and those who lived down there in the valley had undergone a complete change, and she saw them in a new light. She had thought of them only as horrible enemies, but now she realized that they were just miserable beings, such as she had been herself. They were indwelt and tormented by their different besetting sins and ugly natures, just as she had been by her fears. They were wretched slaves to the natures which gave them their names, and the more horrible the qualities which characterized them, the more misery they endured, and the more we should show them compassion. She could scarcely bear the thought, yet for so many years she had not only feared, but also condemned them, had actually disdained their misery, telling herself it was their own fault. Yet she, detestable, fear-enslaved, much afraid, had actually dared to disdain them for the things which made them so wretched and ugly, when she herself was equally wretched and enslaved. Instead of a fellow feeling of compassion and passionate desire that they might be delivered and transformed from the pride and resentment and bitterness which made them what they were, she had just detested and despised them. When she thought of that, she turned to Joy and Peace, who were sitting beside her, and cried out desperately, "Can nothing be done for them down there in the valley? Must my Aunt Dismal be left unhelped, and poor Spiteful and Gloomy too, and those cousins who went so far with us on the way to the high places, trying to turn us back? If the shepherd could deliver me, Grace and Glory, from all my fears and sins, couldn't he deliver them also from the things which torment them?" "Yes," said Joy, who had been Sorrow. "If he can turn sorrow into joy, suffering into peace, how can we doubt that he could change pride and bitterness and resentment and self-pity too, if they would but yield to him and follow him? And your Aunt Dismal could be changed into praise and thanksgiving, and poor Gloomy and Spiteful also. We cannot doubt that it could be done, that they could be completely delivered from all the things which torment them. But," cried Grace and Glory, "how can they be persuaded to follow the shepherd? At present they hate him and won't go near him." Then Peace, who before had been suffering, said quietly, "I have noticed that when people are brought into sorrow and suffering, or loss, or humiliation, or grief, or into some place of great need, they sometimes become ready to know the shepherd and to seek his help. We know, for example, that your Aunt Dismal is desperately unhappy over the behavior of poor Craven Fear, and it may be that she would be ready now to turn to the shepherd. Then poor Gloomy and Spiteful are so wretched that though they felt no need of the shepherd before, it is very possible that now is the time to try to persuade them to seek his help. Yes, exclaimed Grace and Glory, I am sure that you are right. Oh, if only we could go to them. If only there were some way of helping them to find what we have found. Excuse me. At that very moment, close at hand, sounded the voice of the king. He came and sat down beside them, looked with them down into the valley so far below, and said gently to Grace and Glory, Thou that dwellest in the gardens, the companions hearken to thy voice. Cause me to hear it. Canticles 8:13. Grace and Glory turned to him and laid her hand upon his arm. My lord, she said, we were talking about the people who live down there in the Valley of Humiliation. They are my relatives, you know, all of them. They are so wretched and miserable. What can we do for them, my lord? They don't know anything about joy, the joy of the high places and the kingdom of love. There is my poor Aunt Dismal forebodings. I lived with her for a long time and know that she is utterly wretched. I know her, said the king quietly. She is a most unhappy woman. And her daughter, Gloomy, went on Grace and Glory, looking at him entreatingly as she spoke. She married Coward, the son of old Lord Fearing, very rich, but much older than herself, and a miserably unhappy and selfish creature. I believe she has not known a moment's peace since. There was talk in the valley before I came away that he was likely to desert her. He has done so, answered the king quietly, and she has returned to her mother in the cottage, a miserable and delusioned woman with a broken heart. And her sister spiteful, poor soul, with her sharp tongue, which makes so many enemies and deprives her of friends. She married Timid Skulking, and they are desperately poor, and have to live in one little rented room in the house of my cousin Bitterness and his wife. I cannot bear to think of their wretched condition while I live up here in the kingdom of love. They are wretched indeed, said the king, even more gently and compassionate than before. They have just lost the little daughter who poor Spiteful had hoped would be such a comfort to them in their dreary circumstances. And then, continued Grace and Glory, with just a hint of hesitation in her voice, there is their brother, Craven Fear. She did not look at the king as she spoke, but paused a moment then went on hurriedly. He is the most unhappy member of the whole family. He has broken his mother's heart. Neither of his sisters will speak to him any more, and he goes skulking about the valley, hated by everyone. I know him, replied the king gravely, but with just a hint of a smile. I know him well. You do not exaggerate when you speak of his wretchedness. I have had to interfere and chastise him many times to try and correct his bullying propensities. But though I have chastened him, sore I have not given him over unto death. No, no, cried Grace and Glory imploringly. Don't ever do that, my lord. Oh, I beg you, find some way to rescue and deliver him from himself, as you have delivered me. He made no answer for a little while, only looked at her very kindly, and with a look of great contentment and happiness on his face. At last he spoke. I am more than willing to do what you suggest, said he, but, Grace and Glory, these unhappy souls we are speaking about will not allow me into their homes, nor even permit me to speak to them. I need a voice to speak for me, to persuade them to let me help them. I see what you mean, she cried joyfully. We will go down with you and speak to them, and show what you have done for us, and what you are willing and able to do for them. Do you think they will listen to you? He asked, smiling at her very gently as he spoke. No, I don't think it's at all likely. At least, not at first, she answered. I was not at all the sort of person to make them want to listen to me. I did not behave at all lovingly to them, but you will tell me what to say. You will teach me, and I will say it for you. Oh, my lord, let us make haste and go down there. When they see what you have done for me, when they see peace and joy, I do not think in the end they will want you to help. I do think in the end they will want you to help them also. It is because they have lied to themselves about you and have persuaded themselves that you cannot do them good that they resist you and turn from your help. But we plead with them, especially now, my Lord, when they are so unhappy and so despised by others. Their very misery and loneliness and sorrow will make them more willing to listen to news of your grace and of your desire to help them. True, he agreed. That is just what I think. This is indeed a specially favorable time for us to go down and try to help them. He rose to his feet as he spoke. She sprang up too, and all four stood joyful and radiant on the edge of the high places, ready to go, leaping down to the valley again. Then Grace and Joy saw that the great waterfall quite close at hand was leaping down to the valley too, with a tumultuous, joyful noise of many waters, singing as they poured themselves down over the rock lip. From the heights we leap and flow to the valleys down below, sweetest urge and sweetest will to go lower, lower still. Suddenly she understood. She was beholding a wondrous and glorious truth, a great multitude whom no man could number, brought like herself by the King to the kingdom of love and to the high places, so that they could now pour out their lives in gladdest abandonment, leaping down with him to the sorrowful, desolate places below, to share with others the life which they had received. She herself was only one drop among the glad, exultant throng of self-givers, the followers of the King of love, united with him and with one another, each one equally blessed and beloved as herself. For he loves each one of us, she said to herself, as though there were only one to love. The thought of being made one with the great fall of many waters filled her heart with ecstasy and with a rapturous joy beyond power to express. She too at last was to go down with them, pouring herself forth in love's abandonment of self-giving. He brought me to the heights just for this, she whispered to herself, and then looked at him and nodded. At that he began leaping and springing down the mountainside before them, bounding from rock to rock, always choosing, however, leaps which were within their power to follow, and sure footholds for less experienced feet. Behind him went Grace and Glory, with Joy and Peace beside her, leaping down just as the waters leapt and sang beside them. They mingled their voices with the joyful music of many waters, singing their own individual song. Make haste, beloved, be thou like an heart on mountains spicy sweet, and I on those high places where thou art will follow on hinds feet. As close behind the heart there leaps the roe, so where thou goest I will surely go. That, as perhaps you know, is the last verse of the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. But for Grace and Glory it was the beginning of a new song altogether. And that is the end of the book. I hope that you have enjoyed Hinds Feet on High Places by Hannah Hurnard. I think when I first introduced the book I said Hurnard or something weird like that, but it's Hurnard.
You said Bernard.
No, Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this book. It's one of our favorites. Something else that I forgot to mention, this is actually our 201st episode that we have published on this channel. So I hope that you're enjoying Heavy D storytelling, and we've got at least 2 more books ready to read to you. The next one beginning tomorrow, and the next one after that beginning on March 26th. So if you can't get the one that begins tomorrow, you are going to miss out, first of all. And secondly, I think you'll like it. But thirdly, if you can't make it, then for sure come to us on the 26th. And we have it's going to be our 1 year anniversary of Heavy D Storytelling. And maybe we'll have something very surprising. What was everyone's favorite part? That's what Granny Bear just asked. Let's just ask real quickly. Daniel, what was your favorite part?
She got a new look and a new name.
She got a new look and a new name. That's what Daniel said. JJ?
The part where she was walking over to the mountains.
The part where she was walking over to the mountains. That was JJ's favorite part. Kimmy?
The very end.
The very end is Kimmy's favorite part. Mom?
I was gonna say the part where she died.
The part where she died, where she gave up her old heart on the altar. And gosh, my favorite part, I think, is when I get to tease Kimberly in the synopsis, but she doesn't like that too much. So I think that my favorite part is when she receives a new name. So, all right. So,
Grace and glory.
Grace and Glory.
I was right.
Why not you, if you're watching, go ahead and put what your favorite part is down below in the comments. Be sure to like the video and subscribe. Hit the bell to never miss another video. That's JJ's line. And what?
Don't forget to read the comments.
I already read the comments.
But you didn't.
I did. All right. So, So you guys have a super night, and we will see you tomorrow with
I gotta say one thing.
the next book. No, you don't. Actually, I'm just closing. JJ thinks he has to say something.
If you have any books that we want to read after we read the next two books, then
I'm just going to say we've got the books covered for a while. So we don't actually need... I wonder what my new name might be.
I have a good one.
Maybe
one.
your new name is Granny Bear.
Who said that?
Granny
Granny
Bear.
Bear.
Granny Bear said that. Legacy.
Your new name is Cindy.
No, that's her old name. Go sit down. All right. God bless you guys. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye.
That's her young